Baru 57 ya.
5 lah ya, 57.
Iya.
5.
Ya, Pak.
Mulai aja mungkin.
Ya Pak, mau
Oke,
dimulai Pak Wahyu.
tambah cakep ini Pak Adisam.
Assalamualaikum Pak Bos.
Waalaikumsalam. Itu gimana keadaannya itu?
Saya kan udah pindah channel Pak Bos. Udah nggak di situ lagi.
Oh gitu.
Iya.
Baik, Ibu Bapak sekalian, sudah 60 orang. So, as the information from Mita and Mbak siapa, already 290 more person that have been registered, but now still under 70 have been joined in this workshop. What do you think?
Shall we wait 5 minutes?
Okay. Okay.
Then I find the right virtual background.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Your background is ready, Karsten?
It is ready. Can you see me? Can you see? It took a bit time. But I'm ready now, Mita, in case you want to start.
Ya, mau dimulai sekarang, Pak Wahyu?
Ya,
Baik, Pak.
bisa
In bahasa.
share ya?
Ya.
Yes.
Oke.
Just
Selamat
opening.
siang. Oke. Selamat siang, Bapak dan Ibu, baik yang ada di ruang Zoom maupun di YouTube. Selamat datang pada workshop Good Standardisation Practice oleh ARISE Indonesia dan BSN yang akan dilaksanakan hari ini dan besok mulai pukul 1 hingga sore nanti. Untuk pembukaan akan dibawakan oleh Direktur Pengembangan Standar Agro, Kimia, Kesehatan, dan Halal, Bapak Wahyu Purbowasito. Persilakan Pak Wahyu.
Baik, terima kasih Ibu Bapak sekalian. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam sehat selalu kepada Ibu Bapak semuanya. Terima kasih Bapak Ibu semuanya sudah meluangkan waktu untuk mengikuti workshop kali ini. Sekedar mengingatkan saja Bapak Ibu, beberapa kali kita sudah mengadakan workshop. Izin saya untuk sambil mengingatkan apa yang pernah kita lakukan dan bagian dari apa yang akan kita lakukan hari ini. Ini merupakan kegiatan ARISE Indonesia mulai dari 2019 sampai dengan 2023 dengan 4 priority area, kita singkat PA ya. Priority area 1 itu Trade and Investment Policy, priority area 2 itu Trade Facilitation, priority area 3 itu Export Quality Infrastructure, di mana akan membahas tentang standar, conformity assessment, metrologi, dan market surveillance. Kemudian priority area 4 ini IPR, focusing on GI, Geographical Indicator. Kemudian, nah ini 2019, sekedar apa yang sudah kita lakukan selama ini. 2019 ada 2 workshop dalam kerangka kebijakan publik dan regulasi, 16-17 Oktober dan 23-24 Oktober. Nah, kemudian dilanjut dengan 2020, ini sudah masuk, kebetulan pas waktu kita mengadakan, kemudian terjadi pandemi dan semua dilakukan secara sempat, 1 offline, 2 virtual. Pertama adalah standarisasi dan regulasi EU, ini 16 sampai 23 Januari. Di awal tahun masih kita bisa offline, Bapak Ibu. Kemudian virtual ini 10 Desember tentang review prosedur pengembangan standar. Kemudian virtual berikutnya tentang GRP dan RIA, ini 17 Desember. 2021 kita mengadakan 3 days virtual workshop tanggal 16, 18, dan 23 November. Ini sekedar mengingatkan kembali Bapak Ibu apa yang tertuang dalam Undang-Undang Nomor 20, bagaimana kita bicara tentang standarisasi dan penilaian kesesuaian itu untuk meningkatkan jaminan mutu, efisiensi produksi, daya saing nasional, Bapak Ibu, persaingan usaha yang sehat. Dan mungkin yang berkaitan dengan kita adalah yang paling bawah, meningkatkan kepastian, kelancaran, dan efisiensi transaksi perdagangan barang dan atau jasa di dalam dan luar negeri. Ini sekedar mengingatkan kontribusi standar itu di beberapa negara seperti Prancis itu menyumbang 25% dari GDP, Inggris ini pertumbuhan produktivitas pekerja 30% itu. Kemudian Kanada ini juga ada beberapa billion dolar yang kontribusi dari standar. Kemudian Kalau dilihat secara overall keseluruhan, ini standar itu sekitar 27% lebih baik dari economic growth, lebih mempunyai kontribusi 27% dari economic growth, 50% dari capital, dan 150% lebih dari license dan policy. Hal ini diungkapkan oleh Rob Steele di ISO Forum CEO NSB tahun 2013. Begitu kita bicara standar, Bapak Ibu, yang perlu kita ingat beberapa opsi terhadap posisi standar. Mengingat di Indonesia itu lebih dari 64 juta pelaku usaha itu adalah pelaku usaha UMK. Jadi kalau kita bicara garis standar itu, apakah nanti akan kita letakkan di opsi di mana UMK itu bisa mencapai keseluruhan, ataukah di bawah, atau memang baik industri maupun standar itu beyond atau di bawah kualitas yang kita inginkan di dalam standar. Industri yang kita maksudkan ini adalah menengah dan tinggi ya Bapak Ibu. Posisi standar itu ada pada posisi standarnya UMK, atau pada posisi standarnya industri menengah yang mencapai, tentunya dengan dengan catatan bahwa UMK ini tidak bisa mencapai, menjadi tergambar sekitar 64 juta. Itu bagaimana yang harus kita lakukan? Nah, tapi kalau diantaranya berarti industri ada beberapa yang sudah capai, UMK tidak bisa mencapai. Nah, ini yang harus dilakukan. Nah, berkaitan dengan kalau kita mau penetrasi ke pasar, maka umumnya standar yang harus dicapai itu di atas level baik industri maupun UMK. Hal inilah yang harus kita pikirkan Bapak Ibu dalam menentukan standar internasional. Akan sedikit berbeda dalam posisi kita mendorong atau melakukan opsi bagaimana pelaku usaha itu bisa ke arah penetrasi ekspor. Nah, ini yang perlu kita diskusikan ke depannya. Nah, ini dalam menentukan parameter standar itu bisa kita pilih sebenarnya unsur dari safety and health, kita sebut unsur safety, plus alfanya itu quality Bapak Ibu. Nah, seberapa jauh kita bicara safety quality itu nanti akan kita dudukkan. Nah, apakah hanya sedikit lebih baik daripada posisi safety itu sendiri, atau bahkan kita dorong opsi-opsi yang kemungkinan bisa mendorong quality-nya lebih jalan. Tentunya hal ini agak berbeda kalau kita bicara regulasi, maka regulasi harusnya pada posisi safety ini, kemudian sedikit di atas kalau kita memang mau meningkatkan kapasitas ataupun daya saing dari industri yang kita tuju. Tentunya ada tambahan quality sedikit demi sedikit. Kalau sudah mengarah ke yang lebih baik, bisa kita naikkan unsur safety-nya. Hal inilah harusnya kita siasati keseluruhan, dan hari ini kita akan bicara tentang hal tersebut yang mungkin barangkali berkaitan dengan strategi tersebut, dan kita bicara bagaimana negara-negara lain terutama maju melakukan hal ini. Nah, jadwal kita Bapak Ibu tanggal 15 Februari dan 16 Februari itu kita buat beruntun Bapak Ibu, mengingat beberapa waktu lalu kita selenggarakan 3 hari. Di yang pertama banyak sekali yang ikut, yang kedua mungkin karena kelupaan ya. Apalagi yang ketiga, jadi pesertanya turun, jadi hari ini kita padatkan tentunya dengan mempertimbangkan ketersediaan dari narasumber dan juga kemampuan kita untuk menyerap, terutama dalam posisi kita bicara virtual ini Bapak Ibu. Jadi kita batasi 3 jam, untuk itu kita selenggarakan dalam 2 hari, hari ini jam 1 sampai dengan jam 4, dan besok pada jam yang sama Bapak Ibu jangan sampai kelupaan karena ini menyangkut terutama yang hari terakhir, kita akan bicara bagaimana keseluruhan ini kita evaluasi dan menyangkut ke bagaimana delivery tentang internasional standar beberapa negara dan beberapa regulasi yang menyangkut antar negara. Demikian saya sampaikan, terima kasih saya ucapkan kepada Bapak Ibu semuanya yang sudah berkenan hadir. Saya kembalikan ke Mita.
Baik, terima kasih Pak Wahyu untuk openingnya. Sebelum kita lanjut kepada paparan materi dari Karsten, mungkin kita akan sesi foto bersama dulu, Mbak Siti. Bapak Ibu bisa dibantu untuk on cam, nanti akan diambil gambarnya. Monggo.
Baik Bapak Ibu, karena kita ada 6 slide, jadi mohon menunggu ya Bapak Ibu dalam pengambilan gambar, mohon untuk dinyalakan videonya masing-masing. Mbak Maulina, apakah sudah siap? Oke. Oke, baik. Saya hitung ya Bapak Ibu untuk slide pertama. 1, 2, 3. Oke, untuk slide kedua. 1, 2, 3. Oke. Untuk slide ketiga. 1, 2, 3. Oke, untuk slide keempat. 1, 2, 3. Terima kasih. Slide yang kelima. 1, 2, 3. Oke, terima kasih. Dan slide yang terakhir, Bapak Ibu. Oke, terima kasih Bapak Ibu.
Terima kasih Mbak Siti dan Bapak Ibu sekalian. Bapak Ibu, kami sampaikan bahwa nanti selama acara akan ada link daftar hadir. Bapak Ibu bisa sambil mengisi dan akan ada kuesioner di akhir acara. Nanti Bapak Ibu bisa mengisi juga untuk mendapatkan sertifikat setelah sesi besok ya, sesi besok berakhir. Seperti itu. Nanti akan dibagikan link daftar hadir dan kuesionernya. Baik Bapak Ibu, selanjutnya kita lanjut ke paparan dari pemateri kita, Mr. Karsten Kudal. Silakan.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. I'll start sharing my presentation. And let's see, we shall have it like this, much better. Okay, I hope you can all see my first slide. It's good. Super. First of all, good afternoon. It's still morning here in Denmark, where I'm located for the time being. I haven't had the chance to go get into Indonesia for some period because of the quarantine rules. Usually my missions to Indonesia are quite short, 3 weeks. And if I should spend the first week or 10 days sometimes in a hotel, then it becomes a bit inefficient. So therefore my webinars are done from Europe. And it also means that we have to do it in the afternoon, unfortunately. I know this has been an issue for some people, but I can promise you at 4 o'clock, I stop, also if I'm in the middle of a presentation, so that we can just continue tomorrow. So it shouldn't be, I can promise you that we will not go over time today. Firstly, I would like to present myself. Besides being key expert on ARISE Plus Indonesia since 2019, my background is that before I became a consultant working on international projects, I worked at Danish Standards for 12 years, the first couple of years with certification and afterwards with standardization. I trained my colleagues in what we called Danish Standards University. It sounds a bit more serious than it was, but it was a place where we educated both our own staff, but also members of committees, so that they knew what they should meet or would meet when they were sent out from international meetings and so on. And also to put standards into perspective with relation to regulation and so on. At that time, we, not recently, but we had some years before established the so-called single market in Europe, and standards became much more important in the international trade. Earlier, all the countries, they had their own pure national standards, but suddenly we should have the same standards in all the member states of the European Union. So there were a lot of work on that at that time, and I was one of the ones, one of the persons who were, and my colleagues and others. Today we have a workshop. A workshop is probably expected to be an event where you can say a lot and you can discuss, and there are group works and so on. I'm alone with this, and we are there are signed up more than 200 participants. We are not 200 yet, but I simply can't manage it. So there will be some breaks where it is possible to ask questions, and I can go a bit deeper in some of the topics I cover. But I cannot organize working groups and so on. I'm sorry. This is something we sometimes realize when we work as international experts in Indonesia. It is that whenever you do something, there are quite often 80, 100 people attending, and then things become a bit more challenging. I very much agree on the introduction by Pavayu that standards play a big role with regard to the economy, with regard to the value of the products you place on the markets. In Europe, we have made some studies about the value of standards in connection with the establishment of the single market, and it is estimated that the GDP was increased with around 8% because we got these standards to share common standards. It's important to emphasize, when we look at Europe and compare to the rest of the world, we use the standards a bit different in Europe because at least a part of the European standards, they're very closely connected to the framework legislation we have for different product areas. Some of you may have heard about the so-called new approach directives or product directives, where you have an area covered by legislation, and then you have so-called harmonized standards, which give presumption of compliance with the essential requirements in the legislation. This is a way we have connected standards and the regional legislation we have in Europe, which is quite unique. And but still, international standards, they have the same effect, but they are not so closely connected to legislation. It's the ambition from the World Trade Organization that legislations shall be aligned with international standards and vice versa. But we have different situations, different environments in all countries, and therefore we have also different technical regulations and so on, and therefore you cannot have this one-to-one relationship between legislation and standards as we have in Europe. Today we shall talk about good standardization practice, and it's not a topic where we can just small talk for 2 times 3 hours. It is very much related to the rules for conducting standardization work. The program of today is that I will shortly introduce to good standardization practice. Then we have to look at the rules so that we have a common reference on how things shall be done. The advantage in this connection is that I have actually reviewed the legislative framework for the Indonesian standardization activities and realized that it is very much based on international guidelines and directives and principles. So when I tell you about different aspects in the rules, my starting point will be the ISO and IEC rules, but since they are 99% similar to what you have implemented in Indonesia, it's actually very relevant for you, perhaps more relevant for you than it would be in other countries where they have their own set of rules for the national standardization work. After this introduction to the cycle of standardization, we will look at the roles of the key actors in standardization. It's quite important. It's also where you can find your own role. If there are participants today who represent BSN, then there'll be a little reminder about what are the role of the national standards body. But there are also specific obligations and rights for the other actors or for the other players in standardization work, such as the chairman, the secretariat or the secretary of the committee, for the single committee members. And it may not be so common in your daily work with standardization, but if you work on international level, the convener, it means the project leader of a working group, plays a very crucial role. It's quite often the most knowledgeable person in the committee who is appointed as convener. And then you have the members of the working group. They all have different obligations, different rights, and this is what I try to outline so that you know what is your role in different contexts. Then we look a bit on P membership and O membership and how to comment and how to vote. It's all good standardization practice. It's very important for the functioning of the standardization system that people know how to share their opinion with the rest. We are talking about more than 150 members or member organizations of ISO, and if they all submit comments in different ways, or they don't respect voting rules and so on, then it becomes really complicated. So therefore, there are very strict rules about all these things. And again, here I will come around what are the obligations and what are the rights of depending on what kind of membership you, as if you are a member of a committee at BSN, what kind of membership you decide to have in your international work. Finally today, and this is perhaps something we cannot cover today, but I have put it on the agenda, even though it was actually in the first version meant to be tomorrow. I will shortly present the standardization deliverables, because the standardization organization do not only deliver or develop standards, we also develop other kind of technical specifications, technical reports, public available specifications and workshop agreements. Some of them you will never see, but it's something you shall know. It's different kind of tools for different kind of situations. So this will be the agenda for today, and hopefully we can manage it within the time frame. But otherwise, I can promise you, as I said, we will end today's webinar or workshop at 4 o'clock your time. What's the purpose of this workshop or webinar? The purpose is to give the participants an introduction to good standardization practice. And good standardization practice is, in practice, how to follow the rules, how to live up to the expectations the other participants or the organization you are signed in with, if you can say so, what they expect from you. So today is very much about rules, but also about behavior and other things. We can discuss that, and you can also ask questions about it. But I will primarily stick to the rules for participation in standardization. A good standardization practice is, per definition, the best way of developing and publishing standards. It's a good operating practice is a method or a technique that has been generally accepted as superior to any alternatives. Here it is important again to remember that standards is not regulation. When the government decides to regulate an area, then it's because there typically is a problem. It can be water is not clean. Then we have to do something to ensure that the people or the companies delivering water, that they live up to some rules. This is not necessarily, if you talk about standards, then it's another setup. Here, it's not only one interested party for legislation, the public, it's all of us, you can say, but in standardization, it's a wide range of interested parties who are actually involved in standardization. And there may be different kind of interests, and it is reflected in standards. I quite often use the example from elevators or lifts. There is a standard in Europe for lifts because it's covered. There are a lot of safety issues with lifts, and when it was developed, there were developed a number of requirements to lifts, and I can't remember exactly how many. Let's say there were 12 different kind of requirements. 8 of them, they were related to safety. It was what they should live up to when they produce a lift to comply with the safety requirements in the legislation. But the last 4, it was other kind of requirements which actually were put into the work or presented during the standardization work by the big players in the lift business. It is Convener and I don't know, different, mainly European producers of lifts. These 4 extra requirements were very much about quality, not quality with the safety aspect, but quality with regard to hygiene, perhaps to regard to whether could be slippery. I mean, it was just other things. And the reason why they place these requirements here is, of course, that when a public purchaser wants to buy a new elevator, then they just say they shall live up to this standard, and then they get all the requirements, not only the 8 safety-related requirements. And in that way, Convener and all the other big players, they get a little advantage when they shall give an offer. There are other producers of lifts, for example, Chinese. They may not be so advanced, but they are safe. They live up to the first 8 requirements, but not the last 4. So therefore, standardization, it's the best compromise, but it's not only focusing on what a legislation or piece of technical regulation is focusing on. So it is a practice, it's a method, a technique that is generally accepted as superior to the alternatives. So what is the alternative? Is it that we always go for the lowest acceptable, where we just have safety in focus, but not all the other things? So good standardization practice is a bit more complicated in a way than good regulatory practice, which I will cover in some webinars next week, which is very well set as on a basis of some rules. When we talk about standardization, then the first thing you shall think of, and it's something which shall, in the perfect world, it should pop up in your mind sometimes when you say, here, this is not totally in line with the basic principles, the 6 basic principles for standardization. The 6 basic principles for standardization have been set by WTO, by the World Trade Organization. And the first one is to ensure transparency. Transparency is something you can find in some of the rules actually for standardization. Transparency is, for example, that the people who are not participating directly in standardization work and do not directly sitting around the table and influencing the development of a standard, these people who are not there, they shall have a chance to make comments to a standard. This is what you perhaps know is something which is done during the public consultation or the public inquiry period. And they shall have enough time to do that. So there are rules for that. When a standard has been adopted as an international standard, then it shall be published as soon as possible. It shall not be something where the people who have developed the standard, that they adapt their production so that it complies with the new requirements in this new standard. It shall be published immediately so that everybody are aware that now there is a new standard ready for national adoption. And then it's also important to publish programs containing information on the standards currently being prepared and adopted. This rule you have in WTO, in World Trade Organization, that every 6 months you shall publish a work program. It is something which has changed a bit over the years. The rule is still there, or recommendation, but in fact, when you have everything available electronically, it is not exactly, the format is not the same as it was in the beginning, where you had, perhaps you even prepared a little catalog every 6 months, and then you said, we are here with the different standardization projects. These ones have been published. In the next period, we plan to publish these ones, and so on and so on. This is not how it is today, but websites and so on makes it very transparent to follow what is going on with regard to the standardization project. Then you have openness. Openness is another key value or key principle in standardization. Openness is about the possibility for different interested parties to participate in standardization. There are different ways of being a member of a standardization committee. In some countries, it's very direct. You can, as a private person, contact the national standards body and ask if you can participate in a committee. This is possible where I come from. It's a small country. We are glad when people, they want to participate in standardization, but it's also expensive. So you rarely see private persons asking directly if they can participate, but it happens. But when it happens, it's typically professors from university and so on, and they bring in so much knowledge that they get a special prize. It means quite often they get a seat for free, but otherwise companies which wants to participate, they pay a fee, and it's substantial. It's not like a small fee. It's quite expensive in Denmark. In other countries where you have, for example, in Germany, where you have a lot of potential members of committees for each sector, you have a nomination system where an organization is responsible for example, let's say, machinery sector to appoint people to be members of different committees. In that way, there is a kind of a filter between the national standards body and the members, namely these organizations which shall nominate members to the committees. But this is simply for practical reasons. Otherwise, some committees in the German standardization organization, DIN, would be huge. I mean, like 50, 100 people, and it's not manageable. So openness is important, but it's managed in different ways. But it's important that that standardization is not only for the big business and for the public institutions. It's important that also the small and medium-sized enterprises, which in most countries is the majority of the businesses, that they also have access to standardization work. Also, other organizations like NGOs, consumer organizations, and so on, should have seats if they have, I mean, if they can afford it. But quite often, again, you have special arrangements for such organizations which are typically not so rich. They cannot pay the big fee, but in order to have a balance in the committee, it's important also to have these organizations represented, or these interested parties represented. Then we shall ensure impartiality and consensus. Consensus in standardization work does not mean that we all agree 100%, but it means that we try all we can in the standardization process to find a compromise we can agree on. In special situations, but it's rarely in practice, but in special situations, it's simply impossible to meet a person. Perhaps there is a person who's very stubborn and insists on something which where he's alone with this position. In such situations, the rest of the members of a committee have to say, unfortunately, we cannot meet you here. So we move on, and it's still consensus. They will try, before they come to that conclusion, they will try everything they can to find a compromise. Impartiality is something which, especially in standardization or national standardization bodies integrated in a governmental institution. I have been working quite a lot in Egypt, and the standardization body was very closely related to an agency under a ministry, and the priority of the work was very much influenced by this mother organization. So if they needed a standard for their certification activities, then it became top priority, even though there were other priorities which should perhaps be given more attention. The ministry overruled, and they could do it because the national standards body was a part of it. So impartiality is something, it's a basic principle in standardization, and such things as I just described here should be avoided. Then we have effectiveness and relevance. Relevance is something which was given 20 years ago very much attention, because standardization became a kind of the international standardization became kind of elite and developed countries' work. The developing countries, they were not given so much attention, and therefore many of the standards developed under ISO and IEC were not really applicable in countries in Africa and so on, and therefore it was became important to make some kind of better justification of why should we start this work before they started it, so that it was not only for developed countries but also for developing countries. Sometimes the developing countries simply can't, the standard may be relevant, but technologically they are not on a stage where they can apply them, but then they can at least modify them and still use them in that way, but in a modified version. Coherence is another thing. We shall avoid the situations where we have overlap between standards. This is one of the important things we have done in Europe, where the development of all the regional standards for the establishment of the single market ensured that we have standards which are coherent. There are no overlapping standards, and there are no national standards which are overlapping with the European standards. Because when you adopt an European standard in Europe, then you are obliged to, at the same time, to withdraw your national conflicting standards. Finally, there is a development dimension, which is an obligation to the more richer members to help and support members from less privileged areas. On the top of these principles, ISO has also added 3 other principles, namely that there should be stakeholder engagement. This is partly covered by openness, but stakeholder engagement is also about having all the right stakeholders around the table. There should be a respectful and fair process, and then there should be national implementation. National implementation is something each country decide themselves. But of course, it's not the idea that you spend a lot of resources to develop a new standard, and then at the end of the day, only a few members of ISO actually decide to adopt it. There are different reasons why standards are adopted. In some countries, because it's given priority. In other countries, and it's more a financial issue, in other countries, they adopt all the international standards. Then they are available. They don't translate, they don't do anything. They probably use a quick adoption method, namely the one called endorsement method. But the advantage in adopting all the international standards is that when you sell standards as a member of ISO, then if the standard is not adopted as a national standard, if the ISO standard is not adopted and you still sell it, then you have to pay a royalty to the headquarters of ISO in Geneva. And to avoid that, they just adopt all the international standards. I know at least one organization which does it consequently, namely NEN in the Netherlands. And it's not because NEN, they have an interest in all areas, but it's simply just, they have just made it a rule. And in that way, they don't have any costs for royalty. Sorry. Why is good standardization practice important? It's on international level, simply because we have so many members, we have to have similar rules and coordination. For many years, it has been an issue to reduce the production time of standards. And it has been really a mantra in Europe, but also on international level. They found out that when there is a demand for a standard, and then you actually get the standard in your hand after 4, 5, 6 years, then it's too late. So therefore, there are a lot of rules about how quick you can develop a standard and what shall be done during, how much time do we have for each step in the process. And it shall be followed by all the participants, otherwise things will fall apart. There are also clearly defined roles and tasks for all the participants. And it's into the detail. It is described what is expected if you are a member of a working group, what is expected from you. And this is a way to avoid the situation for this specific example that you, for example, bring national interests into the working group. In the working group, you are an expert and you shall find the best possible solution, and you shall not think so much about what is actually the preferences of your national standards body or the nation or the country you come from. You shall think of the best possible technical solution. But if you bring in the national interests into the working group, then things will be delayed. There will be discussions which are more political than actually technical, and then the work is delayed. So clearly defined roles and tasks for all participants is really important. Rules and procedures for all steps in the process. As I said, a lot of time scale or time limits for this and that. This is an important part of it to make the international work proceed as it should. Delivery production time is a key issue, and therefore there are no exceptions. It's not possible to say, okay, we cannot do it within this time. Can we get another half year, another 6 months? It's basically not possible. Then it's back to start again, and then you can try to justify and start a new project again. It's quite strict, and the output is standardized. This is a privilege when you read a standard, and it's no matter if it's a test standard or a management standard. The basic template or the basic format of the standard is the same. Of course, the content is totally different, but the output is standardized. On national level, the rule is good standardization practice is also important. It's you shall ensure influence on international standards development. It doesn't help that you have a meeting after the international meeting has taken place, and then you come after the meeting where the standards have been discussed or the draft standards have been discussed, and then you come, I also have some extra comments here. You have to follow it to make it work. And this is the way you ensure that you have influence on international standards, the final international standards. The standards adoptions are done in a way which ensure coherency. It's on international level, you shall also, you are encouraged as a national standards body to withdraw standards which are in conflict with new international standards. This is something you shall check. When you adopt a new international standards, then you shall check that it is not in conflict with an existing standard. This is the way you ensure coherency. And standards, they are developed with respect of the basic values we have just discussed. I will now go through the process of standardization before we come to the roles and all these things. But it's important when you look at standards to remember that standards is not something which is developed just because it's fun to travel around to meet people and discuss something. There is always a market demand. So the market demand is the driver for the development of a standard. It's also the driver when you prepare the plan for the coming year, for the adoption of the coming year, or for the development of new standards for the coming year. And before you have a standard, there is a process you are going through. There is a preliminary stage, a proposal stage, preparatory stage, committee stage, public inquiry stage, approval stage, and then you publish. And after some time, you review what you published and find out whether it shall be withdrawn or there is still a market demand, and then we revise the standards. I will now go through each of these stages in the following slides. The preliminary stage, the proposal stage, it's sometimes a bit difficult to make very clear line between one stage and another. Is the stage where you, it's the stage where you clarify. It's also the market demand to clarify with your different stakeholders what is needed. A lot of stakeholders can come with inputs to a new standardization project, a new proposal. And there are, of course, the beneficiaries, the users of the standards. It's regulators which play an important role. In Europe, a less important role than earlier, but when they developed the legal framework for the single market with all these framework legislation for machines and for toys and for electrical equipment and so on, they mandated, they gave orders, you can say, to the standardization organizations in Europe to develop standards which supported this legislation. So the regulators played a big role at that time. Now they play a less important role. They still ask the CEN and CENELEC and ETSI, the three European standardization organizations, to develop standards, but not on the same level as earlier. Then you have society. It's very broad. It's a very broad word to say, because you don't get typically a proposal for a new standard from a school, but there may be something coming up in the society, in newspapers and so on. We say, here we have a problem as a society. Perhaps we should try to standardize it a bit. Consumers, realistically, even though consumers are always very welcome in standardization work, in practice, in many countries, the consumer organizations are only really active in specific areas, like, for example, toys. Consumers is very much, in many countries, consumers are very much focusing on toys and things for children and so on, the safety of these things. They are not very much into safety of machines or boilers or things like that. But from the consumers, you will quite often find or get proposals. And also, since many of the proposals are developed in committees, then it is their inputs in the committees which end up with a new proposal. Then we have importers. Industry, of course, industry use standards mostly as a communication tool. Originally, it was the industry which was a driver to develop new standards because they needed communication tools. Suddenly, things were not handmade in the local workshop, but it was perhaps bought far away and brought to, let's say, a construction site or whatever. And then it was important that there was a common understanding of what should be delivered, and therefore standards were developed to support communication. So industry, they still have a lot. And of proposals, and it's also a way to ensure that the competition is fair on the markets. I'm from a country where we have a big producer of windmills, and windmills, it's the standards for windmills. It's not how you build a it's about safety, and it's about performance. Because how do you measure that this windmill is better than another windmill? So therefore, there are a lot of standards for windmills, which is very much focusing on performance and how to measure, so that when you make an offer to somebody who wants to buy a windmill, then you can actually compare your offers because they have been tested in accordance with a specific standard developed. But it's the industry which has an interest in this, so that there is more transparency in their offers. Then we have traders. We also have influencers like medias, trade unions. Trade unions have, where I come from, or had earlier, a big say when it come to standardization. Many years ago, before we had an ISO standard for occupational health and safety, there was a voting at Danish standards where they voted whether they wanted to have such a standard, and the trade unions, they were very much insisting that they should have such one because it was would benefit their members, while the industry, they were very much against it because they were afraid that now it became kind of mandatory to implement an occupational health and safety system at their factory or whatever, and it was extra costs. But the trade union, at the end of the day, they won. Then we have NGOs, quite often very specific areas they are focusing on. Could be environment, could be other things. Business associations, they represent a group of businesses, and especially business associations for the small and medium-sized enterprises. They are important because when you look at how the distribution is between big companies and small and medium-sized companies and so on, then the small and medium-sized, it's also when it comes to how many people are employed there, it's much bigger than the big ones. So therefore, the SMEs are really important. And it's also important for the national standards bodies that SMEs are using standards, because this is a way to develop a business and be able to, perhaps at a later stage, also to export your product, simply because you are aware and familiar with standards. Then you have regulators. It's very common. They've mentioned 2 times here, because they are not only beneficiaries, but they are also governance. They you have council boards, line ministries, agencies, all these different regulators or institutions which are leading a country. They have a direct influence and also a direct needs for standard. And then you have internal TC members. I will just put a point at them as perhaps the most important ones, because if you look, especially on international level, on new proposals for standards, then the TC members play a big role. And it's the reason is that standards, especially in the more technical areas, it's a complicated thing. And if you sit in a committee and discuss something, agree on a standard, then quite often you have to say, but we cannot include this and we cannot include that. And then automatically the side effect of your discussion is that you actually define or identify new areas where we also need a standard. So many of the proposals are coming from the TC members, but also from other, of course, but TC members is really important. In the proposal phase, you shall have your proposal registered. This is something you do at the in Geneva in the Central Secretariat. But before you do that, you shall do an evaluation of the proposal. It's very important to start standardization work. So therefore, there should be a good justification for starting such a work. So a justification is a part of this registration process. You shall check for overlaps with already published standards. Sometimes, especially if you work with more horizontal standards, it's quite complicated. So therefore, you should also establish what we call liaison. It means a connection between your committee and another committee so that you don't overlap standards developed under another committee. You should find out if there are stakeholders who are willing to participate. When you start a new piece of work, you also start a big machine, and you people have to meet. Of course, now we have learned here during the pandemic that it is possible to work a lot online, but still the most efficient way to work is if you sit in front of each other, meet in the evening for a dinner and find solutions. It's simply not possible online, but it costs a lot of money, and traveling around the world to participate in meetings, it's a big machine, as I said. So therefore, there should be a really good justification also before you start this. You should find out if there is funding available. You're not paid for participating in standardization. You're actually paying for it. And when you start a new piece of work on a new standard, then you shall have a secretariat, and this secretariat is costly. So there is always a kind of a business case for each standardization project, and a part of this, of the costs, is the cost to the secretariat. The way it is financed is that if, for example, Danish standards wants to have the secretariat for a committee working with windmills, then we go to the big company in Denmark in this field, namely Vestas, and say, will you finance the secretariat for this? And then they say, yes, we would love to do. We would also love to be a convener for the working group which shall develop the standards. And then you have, in a way, the funding in place. The other participants shall cover their costs themselves. And it can be done through the national standards body if they have money for such things, or through funding from the private sector. I could see there was one who has raised his hand. I don't know if I should take the question immediately. If so, you're welcome to step up. Okay, we have a couple of questions. Shall we take them now?
Yes, Carsten, you have two questions from participants, I think. One from Pak Jaya and one from Ibu Nelly. Can you see it now?
Yeah. I probably have to turn up. Can we have the question?
Yes.
I'm looking for my translation in case, unless I get it in English, of course.
Hi, Carsten. The question is all in English. There are three questions. First is from Ibu Nelly.
Yeah, let me hear.
It's from Ministry of Manpower. The question is, why is the certification and standardization of the national industry in Indonesia still lagging behind a number of neighboring countries in Asia?
certification is like, I mean, is it lagging behind? I mean, you can look at standardization and certification in different ways, but basically standards, they are not made to be used for certification. Standards are made to as a communication tool, as I said. Standards are not good to be used as a kind of a mandatory legislation or a mandatory certification. So if you are lagging behind in the way that you don't have so many certification schemes as the other one, I think you are perhaps more like in Europe, which is quite developed, as you know. So certification becomes quite often kind of a mandatory, because people think that then there's a kind of proof that they actually comply. But it's costly, and who shall pay it? I mean, perhaps the company pays it in the first place, but in the second place, it'll be the customers who pays it. I think it shall never be an ambition to make a lot of certification schemes. It shall be an ambition to use standards in the right way, namely as technical specifications for different kind of products and processes and tests and so on. But making it mandatory, it tends to be quite often a kind of a technical barrier to trade, and this is not something you shall go for. I don't know if it was an answer to the question, but perhaps it was a try. Let me have the next question.
Okay. The next question is from Pak Jaya from Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources. The question is, would you care to re-elaborate or elaborate more on the 6 TBT committee principle on standardization, example, development dimension? Thanks.
Yeah.
Sorry, Carsten. If Bapak Ibu, jika ada yang mau bertanya langsung juga boleh langsung ya Pak. Bapak Ibu, jadi karena ada fungsi translation, jadi jika Pak Jaya mau menyampaikan lagi informasinya boleh silakan. Tapi Carsten akan, oh ya, ini Pak Jaya is raising hand. Maybe he wants to talk to you directly. Is it okay, Carsten?
Yeah, it's also okay.
Okay.
Hello.
Yes, Pak Jaya, silakan.
Hello, Carsten.
Hi.
Yeah, I don't quite get it when you explain about the development dimension and what actually it is and how it is important to the standardization process. But first of all,
the development dimension is aimed at the developing countries, basically. It's an obligation for the resource-rich members to help support the less resource-rich members. Let me give you an example. It can be very complicated for a country in Africa, for example, to hold a secretariat. So therefore, there are some twinning secretariats where you team up. For example, the Swedish Standardization Organization, they were teaming up with, I think it was the Tanzanian standardization body, and together they held a committee, or the secretariat for a committee. In that way, you develop the competences in this organization, because it's not realistic that they can take such a secretariat themselves, because it is costly. What you also do, what they did from Swedish side, was that the SIDA, it's a development agency in Sweden, they actually financed all the traveling costs and other costs they had in Tanzania to be a part of this training. So the development aspect is is related to developing countries. But I cannot give you a lot of good examples, but this is a good example on how you help them up on the same level, because it became an issue both with regard, as I said, to relevance of the standards, that they were not really relevant to many of the members, but also to develop their competences and yeah.
So it is more from the developed countries to the developing countries.
Yeah.
Or yeah.
It is.
Okay. Thank you.
You can say it doesn't bring much. I mean, when you say a word like development, then it can inspire to a lot of different sorts. But it is actually this one, so that they have this taken this into account and not only focus on all the other principles, which are of course very basic for the work of the standardization. This is a kind of an extra. National implementation, which was another one. Why should we develop all these international standards if we don't adopt them? I mean, then it still makes sense, because you can use, also in Indonesia, you can use a standard when you have a contract with a company abroad, a standard which has not been adopted as a national standard in Indonesia. It's no problem. It's a communication tool. But if you really want to promote things, then if the standardization body stands behind the standards and say, we adopt it as a national standard, of course, it's a decision which is quite often taken by the committee, but we stand behind these standards and we adopt them, then it gives, it somehow support the whole implementation of common standards internationally. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay, you're welcome. Did we have more questions? Or is
yes. Yeah. But how many questions do you want to take this session, or should you continue first? I think we have 2 more questions.
Okay, we can take 2 more questions and then we continue.
I see. Okay. The third question is from Ibu Tati from Mutu Agung. It says that our product has ISO 22000, but when we plan to export to Saudi, they still need us register our product to SFDA, and to Dubai must register or recognized by ESMA.
Yeah, and I have just, by coincidence, I have just made recently a study about the Gulf countries and Saudi Arabia and the Emirates and Bahrain and Oman and so on, and it is, a certification is not enough. I mean, they have so many internal certification requirements in these countries that I'm not surprised. I mean, this is, now we're talking about food products, but if it's other kind of products, it's the same. I mean, even though, so a certification is not internationally recognized. A certification is a way of harmonization. Now, I will not go deep into the accreditation system, but we have CAN in Indonesia, the accreditation body. They are member of Ilac, and I think also IAF. Ilac is the international organization for accreditation bodies accrediting laboratories. When you have, so now say, okay, now CAN is in a way connected to all the other members of Ilac, then there should be some kind of mutual recognition or something like that. There is not. Ilac, if you look at what is actually the purpose of Ilac, then it is to harmonize the procedures, that they use ISO 17025, which is for management of a laboratory. They use it in the right way, and if you are really one of the signatory members of Ilac, then you have a peer evaluation. It means that another standard accreditation body come and look you over your shoulder and see if you do it the right way. This is, but still there's no mutual recognition. So there is a big value of a ISO 22000 system for sure. It's food safety, it's hazard, and it is important. but still in many countries, could also be in Indonesia, they don't recognize it. They want to comply with their own rules. And they have, in these countries in the Gulf, they have a lot of national regulation. And I will not go into a lot of details about this, but Emirates and Saudi Arabia, this is the worst, but these are also the two big economies in this region. But they have really a lot of the special certification requirements. So, yeah, you have to look at the rules. Ibu Tati, she has to look at the rules in the country where you export to and try to comply or give advice on that. Yeah. Sorry.
Okay, Karsten, the next one. It's from chat in the YouTube. It's from Pak Syahril Daulay. Mr. Karsten, how is your experience driving standardization in developing countries?
I have worked in many different countries, developing or less developed countries, also countries after wartime where the institutions are a bit have fallen apart. The most comparable one, I mean, a big one, I don't see it was in Egypt. It's 80 million people. It's an old system, but I think when you look at the resources in these organizations, then the resources come from the government, as it does in Indonesia. And therefore, the government in many of these countries, they want to have a say. So this in how things are managed and what is prioritized and so on. This is sometimes a problem in developing countries, that the influence of one of the stakeholders, namely the government, it is too big. This, I don't see that as a problem in Indonesia, but Indonesia is also a transition economy. It's another level, like Thailand or Malaysia, whatever. So it's another situation, but real developing countries, it is in fact kind of an agency where all standards are developed based on requirements from the government, and it makes it so that it doesn't live up to the 6 basic principles, or 9 if we include the 3 other ones, but at least the 6th one. No, this is a big problem. Resources. It's a update of standards which have been withdrawn, simply to modify standards so that they can be applied in the countries. There are a lot of issues when you are working in a developing country. So, but what we do usually as consultants is to simplify things a bit, and try to say, don't adopt standards just because the government has said that you are too slow to adopt. This is what we saw in Egypt. They just adopted 1,500 standards overnight with the endorsement method, which is kind of a rubber stamp method. And they didn't know what they had adopted. But it was just because the government wanted to show that they could adopt standards. And so there are challenges there. This is what I say. So when I was there, we withdraw a lot of standards. It was difficult because it's difficult to explain to the ministry that now we just withdraw some standards because we don't sell them. They are not really relevant. But this is what we did. Simplification, it's called, I think. Yeah. Was it the last question?
Yes, Karsten. So
okay.
I think it's time for you to continue.
Yeah, but I will speed up a bit. We are through the proposal phase now. We have agreed that this standard shall be developed, and then we start the preparatory stage. It means that we should prepare the first draft. And here it is so that we create a working group and we appoint a convener, typically the most knowledgeable one in this technical area. You shall remember, if you look at a committee on ISO level, then a committee may cover quite a lot of different kind of standards. But there are always people who are good in this specific area where you should develop a new standard, and then he will be appointed as project leader or convener. And then you nominate experts. And this is where it's important to emphasize that when you are sitting, you are there with your knowledge. You are not there because you represent Denmark or Indonesia. You are there because you know a lot about this. And even though you're mirror committed back home, they say that you shall ensure, if you are sitting there, you shall ensure that this and this is prioritized, and we don't keep out this because it creates a lot of problems here. You have to forget that and say, what is the best possible technical solution we can agree on? This is your task when you are. So you are not a representative of a country in a working group. You are a representative because you are knowledgeable, because you are a technical expert. Sometimes, as it's written here, a standard is prepared beforehand. There are still developed national standards. I don't know about halal standards so much, but I have actually lived a couple of years in Indonesia, in Palestine, and it's a Muslim country, and they focused very much on halal. And but the fact is that there are different kind of halal standards all over the world. And if you wanted to say, for example, to ISO, we want to develop this halal standard, then it wouldn't be a big surprise to the relevant committee if you come with a final version. This is how we think it should look like. This has happened many times from BSI, the British Standards Institution. If you go back on such an important standard as ISO 9000, then the first version of ISO 9000 was more or less identical with the British standards. It was developed, I think, for the army or for the military, because it was important that all these bullets and whatever you produce in this industry, that they were produced correctly so that they didn't explode at the wrong time and so on. So a lot of standards are actually developed before you even start the work formally in the committee. It's also an advantage because there's some time limits. When you start a project, you shall decide how long shall it be. Shall it be a 24 months project? Shall it be a 36 months project? Or shall it be a 48 months project? I will not go into details about this, but when you have, depending on what kind of project or duration you decide for your project, you should be really quick on each step. So if you start from scratch, you may say you may have to realize it will take 4 years before I have a standard ready. If you have a standard already and the committee members more or less think that this is good, then you may go for 24 months to finalize it and have it in public inquiry and approved. So this is a preparatory stage. Then you have the committee stage. Now the standard is ready. They present it, the convener presented in the committee, and here you have all the flags on the table. You can say, here you can say, this guy, he represents Sweden, or this guy represents Germany, and this guy represents Malaysia. And then they discuss the working draft. Of course, if they have these different countries, if they have had members in the working group, then they are well informed about what you should discuss here. Because if something has been agreed on working group level, but you know that you have agreed as an expert something which could be criticized by your mirror committee, then there is a chance in the discussion at the TC level, there is a chance to change it, to say this is not a good idea, and then it may be sent back to the working group with some comments, and finally they can present a draft which is ready for the public inquiry. So the public inquiry is the next phase. The public inquiry represents transparency. This is the only time where you actually, before you adopt a standard or approve a standard, this is the only time where the public, they can look into the standard and say, is it something we can actually use? And the public is, of course, all these people, interested parties who have not participated directly in the work, but they shall also have a chance to have a say. Here you see, as I said, next week I have a webinar about good regulatory practice. Here you see a clear a parallel to what you see in good regulatory practice, where you shall, when you have a draft piece of legislation, then you shall publish it. Let it be discussed in the public. Let them come up with all their concerns. This is too expensive. Nobody has this advanced test material or test equipment or whatever. All these things can be brought up in general in good regulatory practice, and it's also what you could bring up here. But you should publish your standards. The standard should be published. It means that it will be sent out to all the members of the of ISO, and they can make it public available on the website so that they can get comments from the public. In fact, or in practice, you don't get many comments. They have 60 days to make comments. It means that when it's sent out to the national standards bodies, they have more time than 60 days, but they get some extra days so that they can prepare, publish, and receive comments to the standards. It's different how this public inquiry is carried out. Typically there is a website, but sometimes it's also supported with individual notification of major interested parties. So if you, for example, work, let's say, on a standard or revision of the standard for occupational health and safety, which has a huge interest of the labor unions and so on, then you may send this draft directly to these major stakeholders and ask them if there is something they disagree with. So it's a bit up to the national standards body how they execute this. But a website is a typical tool today, and sometimes, as I said, followed up with individual notifications. Then you compile all the comments. There are two kinds of comments. There are technical comments. It means that you want to change something in the technical requirements, for example. And then there are editorial. The editorial, since we work in English, the editorials are quite often from the English-speaking or the native English-speaking people who say that you cannot write this because it may sound right for an engineer in the committee, but you can't write it like this because it has another meaning when you read it as a native English-speaking person. So there are typically some editorial corrections, but they are just a help to the secretariat. The technical ones are more important, and they will be discussed at the next meeting at the TC. Here it's, I think people who have been involved in such work, they must admit that if you are not at the meeting, sitting there arguing why this comment is important, then many of the comments they are just put aside and said, okay, why didn't they participate if this is suddenly so important? Because it's a committee, technical committee, which at the end of the day decides whether the comments are relevant or not. So, and if they have worked for a long time to agree on something, and then you have comments, then you may not accept them. So this is a weakness in the system, but yeah, they're only human beings. So this is how it is. When a standard is out for public inquiry, there is not only comments, there is also a vote. So the standard is not necessarily going out for a vote afterwards. Quite often, in many cases, the vote there are three possibilities. You can vote yes, then you're supported. You can vote no, or you can abstain. If you say most of the organizations, they are typically not interested in a standard, so they just abstain, then they are just not part of the whole calculation of whether a standard is approved. But if they say no, you should come with a justification why you have to say no. And this will be good. And again, it is a committee which decides whether this justification is strong enough. Because if it's not, if it's just a no and then some blah, 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 then you can just ignore it. If 2/3 of the P members, it means the participating members, the members who are showing up at the meetings in the committee, if 2/3 of them say yes, and not more than 1/4 of the votes are negative, then the standard is approved. And this is, as I said, in many cases, this is what happens, that the standard is approved because the people who are voting are the people who are actually been involved in this in the work. Sometimes you have this, you can see that if the comments are accepted by the TC and incorporated in the draft, then you can still approve it in the committee. Then you still prepare the final standards, and you do the final editing of the standard. You can have a round of voting also. If the comments during the public inquiry is so, comprehensive, there are so many comments that you actually have changed quite a lot of the standards, then you can send it out for voting again. So you have a kind of a second round after it has been adapted based on the comments from the public inquiry. So this is a possibility. But then you have it approved, you can publish the standards and make it available for the public, and then it's ready for national adoption. There's no rules about who shall adopt the standards when they are published, but there is a clear expectation that all the organizations which have said yes, voted yes for the standard, they are expected also to adopt the standard as a national standard. And of course, more can do it if it's a standard where there is a demand for it in the single countries. Review of standards is something which should be done on a regular basis. Sometimes, and it's actually the committee which decide when it shall be done. It should be done at least every 5 years. Sometimes I hear that we do it every 5 years, but this is just as late as it must be, or it can be. Sometimes the committee say that the technological development in this area is going so fast, we have to do it earlier. So we make a review after 2 or 3 years already. And then we may change it if we find out that things have changed so much that the standard is not, perhaps it's even a bit obsolete. But review should be done every 5 years at the latest. If it's still good after 5 years or less, then you can just approve it for a new period. If it needs revision, then the technical committee initiate a revision of the standard. If it's obsolete or outdated, then the standard is withdrawn. What does it mean for the national standards body when a standard is withdrawn or revised? They can decide that we actually prefer the old version. We don't need to, we don't think that we have to adopt the newest version. And we can also keep a standard even though ISO has withdrawn it. I mean, if they say it's obsolete in ISO, they may think it's not obsolete in Tanzania. So they just keep it. This is the sovereign right of the national standards body. They decide what standards shall be national standards. What we typically see is that the standards, when they are revised, they are also withdrawn by the national standards body which have adopted them, and then they are replaced with the newest version. And why that? If you're a company in Indonesia and you have used the international standard for a while, then it is revised by ISO, but then BSN decides not to revise it in Indonesia, then you may have both domestic customers who are used to use your old standard, and you may have international customers who expect you to use the newest standards. And it can give you some complications as a company, and can also give you extra costs because you may have to comply with two different sets of requirements depending on whether you want to sell your product on the domestic market or the international market. Standards are voluntary, so you are not obliged to follow the old standard on the domestic market. But if this is what the customer expects, then you can be forced into this situation. And this is something which shall be avoided, of course. Okay, I've been talking for 1.5 hours now around that. We still have 1 hour, 15 minutes left. Before we start with the role of the key actors, I will have a 5 minutes break and just to have something to drink. And then I'll come back and continue on this. Mita, is it okay? 5 minutes break? If Mita is...
Yes, Carsten.
Okay, thank you. Whoever it was.
5 minutes break.
5 minutes break, all can stand up and stretch legs, and hopefully back in 5 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Halo Mbak Mita.
Ya, Pak Tengku.
Tadi saya ada kirim WA ke Japri. Saya mau tanya itu ada tiga apa di slide mungkin ke slide keempat gitu ya. dari prinsip OTDEC itu loh, openness, transparent, impartial itu. Terus itu yang menurut TBT. Tadi ada lagi yang ISO menambahkan lagi apa ya? 3 itu, satunya stakeholder engagement, 2 lagi.
Saya cek WA Bapak ya Pak, sebentar Pak.
Iya, thank you.
I'm back. If there are any questions now, I can take them. Also about certification, if it's something of interest, which is of course related also to a certain degree to standards. But otherwise, I will just continue. I think the last item on the agenda today may be taken out and just taken tomorrow instead, but tomorrow it was a light program, so it shouldn't be a problem. So, but let me continue. What we have talked about until now are the main principles of standardization, the principles where you should say something is wrong here. If you are, for example, dictated to do something by the government, then you should say, shouldn't we ask others? If standards are not reviewed within 5 years, it's also something you should be aware of, because it's all a part of good standardization practice to respect these basic principles so that the portfolio of standards are relevant and up to date if possible. So all these things is something you should have in mind. But when you look at the different roles, which we are going to do now, of the key actors, then of course you may see something, but it's not necessarily your task to take initiative to do something, but you can remind the right person. Now you will learn what are the responsibilities, rights, and obligations of the different key actors in standardization. And we have these 7 ones: the National Standards Body, the Technical Committee. The chairman of the committee has a special role. We talked about a little earlier the voting process. It's actually typically the chairman together with the secretariat who decides whether a standard which has received comments, also technical comments in the public inquiry phase, whether this standard has been changed so much now that they have to go out for a vote, a second round, you can say. This is something the chairman, a decision the chairman takes together with the secretariat. The secretariat plays a much more important role than it sounds like. It's not just a secretary you send. You send typically a well-educated engineer or another one with a really good experience in standardization and standardization rules who holds the secretariat for a committee. The members of the committee who represents the different countries, the convener of the working group, the project leader of developing specific standard texts, and the members of the working groups. I will shortly go through all these 7 ones to give you a better understanding of what are the main tasks they have. The National Standards Body has, in old days, the main task was to work as the secretariat for the committees. The Standards Body is totally impartial. If you look at how, in the electrotechnical world, how the standards bodies or the national standards bodies were the title of the National Standards Body in old days, it was always the National Committee. And the National Committee had this secretariat, which was the National Standards Body. So the National Standards Body has today the task of establishing new committees when it is needed. And then they shall carry out secretarial services. And it can both be on national level, which is a typical one in Indonesia, but it can also be on international level. It's the same persons we are talking about. Typically, the person or the staff which is sent out to hold secretariats for international committees, they are the more experienced ones. Or you send a team, you send 2 persons who carry out the secretarial tasks in connection with meetings in the technical committee. There are some of these committees which are quite big, and they may, when they meet, they may have a lot of VG meetings at the same time. It means that you have a committee, but before the committee meets, then the working group members, they meet already a couple of days before perhaps to discuss or finalize some work. And it is the task of the secretariat to coordinate all this. Then they shall manage regional and international cooperation. I was, in my position at Danish Standards, one of the persons who were sent out to general assemblies for ISO, for SEN and Senelec, to represent Denmark. And this work is also important. There are levels of management levels in these organizations where it can be of interest for a national standardization body to be represented. It's also a resource demanding task. If you, for example, are selected to the technical management board. They have a lot of meetings around the world. It's expensive, and it takes a lot of time from the manager who is selected or who is appointed for this. But this is a part of the whole networking also in the standardization work. Then you should be independent and non-partial, which is one of the basic key values or principles in standardization. You shall ensure involvement of stakeholders, both on committee level and on management level. On committee level, it's about not only having industry and perhaps a public a representative of a public institutions, but it's about having traders and NGOs and consumers represented if it is possible. In practice, it is very difficult, especially because, as I said earlier, it costs money. So unless they say in this specific area, we really need a representative of the consumers. So therefore we invite them, and then they can have a seat for free. But it is the national standards body, which they are financed by these monies. So they are very much involved in such decisions. It's not the committee which just invite representatives, for example, of consumers, because it's the whole system is based on payment. This is not the case in Indonesia, as far as I remember or know. And it may make it easier to involve a broad range of stakeholders. Also on management level, where I came from, we had, besides technical committees, we also had sectorial committees earlier. Sectorial, which covered, for example, machines and construction and other areas under one, and then we had a sectorial committee covering all the committees in the electrotechnical world and so on. In these committees, you should also try to ensure that all different stakeholders are represented. The technical committee, the role is to prepare standards, or at least ensure that it is done, provide the overall direction for standardization projects, including setting and agreeing on objectives, approaches, and outcomes. When you start standardization work, it's very important to have a clear picture of what should be the end result, what should be the output of this work. So writing scope of a standard is very crucial, because just a little word, twisting a little word, a single word can change the whole content of a standard. Then they shall review existing standards and related documents, if there are any, contribute to the technical, contributing technical expertise to international standardization activities. As I said, sometimes there are standards which are actually could be covered by several committees, and then you have this liaison between the committees to where you discuss how to shape a new standard so that it is not in conflict with standards under different committees. You shall appoint a drafting leader or a drafting team. You quite often have some kind of editorial team or working group under a committee, an editorial one which is checking the wording. The wording of engineers from all over the world is quite often the same, but it's not necessarily real native English wording. So you have that, but you also have the drafting leader, which is a convener of a drafting team who should develop a new standards. You provide assistance to the project manager. Okay, it's perhaps overlapping what I just said. communicating critical decisions and deliverables from the project to the project manager. The project manager is actually the central secretariat in Geneva. If you have something which is very critical, then you can bring it up on a higher level. And then you should work towards resolving issues, and where these cannot be resolved, recommending a possible solution. These are the tasks of the technical committee. The chairman of the committee, he ensures that the technical committee works in accordance with the agreed plan. As I said, when you start standardization projects, then you should decide how long time shall it take to develop these standards. He is the one, together with the secretariat, to follow up on these plans and ensure that things are on track. Ensure that a clear task is given to the working group, that the scope, it means the scope of the work is clear, that they know exactly what to do, so that when they come back to the technical committee, they come back with a product you expect and not something else. Ensure coordination of the work of the TC with the working groups and monitor implementation and so on. You shall chair the meeting in an impartial manner. It means that even though you are Danish, then you cannot sit there and raise the Danish flag all the time and say, but in Denmark, you are impartial. You are not playing the role as representative of, for example, Denmark in such a situation. You shall find solution and think about the work and not the national interests. Ensure that all TC decisions are clearly formulated. This is probably something you know, the people of you who are active in standardization, that there are written decisions, and it's always something which is discussed a lot, so that it has a clarity to the members. And secure consensus. It means you cannot sit and you cannot ignore, even though there may be a person who is very annoying, you cannot ignore persons who are participating. Their opinion may be just as good as others, even though they are a bit different. So you should try to find solutions where all opinions somehow are merged into one common opinion. And then you shall act impartially at all times. The secretariat, as I said, much more important than usually. I mean, sometimes more important than the chairman, because the chairman and the secretariat is working closely together, and many of the advices to the chairman is given by the secretariat based on experience. So the secretariat acts as a point of contact for the committee, and they also act as project administrator. It means that they shall ensure that all these basic documents, there is a work plan or a strategy for a committee, that they are updated and all the time. They shall ensure that a balanced committee exists throughout the lifetime of the project. It means that if one steps out of the committee who represents a certain interest or a certain group of stakeholders, then the secretariat shall try to find one to replace this person or these interests. Assist in providing advice to the committee members and to the chair. There are a lot of rules. I mean, just in ISO, you have ISO directives part 1 and part 2. It's quite thick documents with a lot of details, and sometimes it's not written in a way so it's very easy to understand for people from outside, people who are not fully working all the time on standardization. In such cases, it is the secretariat or the secretary who has the experience and who can give advice on how it should be understood. In conjunction with the committee, develop and maintain the scope and drafting activity and the delivery plan. Ensure compliance with the scope. create a project schedule, you have sometimes a lot of ideas. And if you think about the process of developing a standard, then we have this preliminary stage where you find out how to formulate and justify a new project. Sometimes there are so many good ideas that you have to put something in the drawer. And even though it's a good work proposal, then you simply have to wait until there are resources to develop the standards. This kind of work is, or suggestion how to solve it, is typically done by the Secretariat. Then we come to the committee members. They, when you are a committee member, then you also commit yourself to work. It's not only meetings. Sometimes you get the task of drafting, of reviewing a text drafted by another person. You shall discuss actively with the other members of the committee about the decisions or the drafts. You shall attend the meetings whenever possible. There's nothing more frustrating than inviting to a meeting with 15 people and only 5 of them shows up because at their work there is something more important, and standardization is so slow that they don't give it priority. So when you decide to be a member of a committee, you should also give it high priority. Participating fully in all committee work based on the members' knowledge and experience. Here it is obvious that there are no free meals. I mean, even though you pay to be a member of a committee, then at the same time you should also work. And especially if you have a certain knowledge or expertise in a specific area, and for example, there is a need for this expertise in the drafting of a new standard, then you are obliged to participate. You should be impartial and broadly representing national interests. You should follow international principles and transparency and all the other principles we have discussed earlier today. Pursuing the objectives of the members' nominating organization. As I said, it's not always so that you can just contact the National Standards Body and be a member of a committee. Quite often you are nominated by a nominating organizations, which could be a labor organization which nominate people to participate in different committees. Working towards alignment with international standards. Alignment is coherency. You shall ensure that when you work on standards, then can also work together with other standards. You shall vote at the ballot stage, and the vote, if the vote is negative, you shall clearly present why and the technical justification. The technical justification is that this standard is simply incompatible with all the technology we have in this field in our country. Then it could be a justification why the standard should not be adopted. Then we have the convener, the technically knowledgeable person who is responsible for drafting or for developing a new standard. He is responsible for the activities of the working group established by the TC. Sometimes he plays both a role as project manager and secretary. If it's a big committee in the ISO system and you have a lot of work in a working group, then sometimes there's allocated a secretary to support the convener in a working group. It can be the same secretary as the one who is managing the technical committees, because when you have a technical committee meeting, then, as I said, quite often the working groups, they show up a few days earlier, have their own meetings, and then they present their work in the committee at the end of their stay at the place they have decided to meet. So therefore, the secretary for the technical committee may be available for the convener. Otherwise, and it's quite common, the convener is actually the one who also writes the minutes and the decisions taken in the working group. So it's a hard work to be a convener. But he also chairs the meetings or convenes the meetings and acts as a chairperson for the working group. And then, of course, he should be a project manager in the way that he shall ensure that you have progress in the work. There are some timelines depending on how much time you have decided to allocate for the development of the standards, but this shall be respected. And if there are some delays, he shall report that to the parent body, it means to the technical committee. Then we have the members of the working group. The members of the working groups are appointed as experts. They don't have any role as a convener where they shall lead or they shall chair meetings. They shall just be there because they are knowledgeable. They do not represent national interests, as I've said before. It's of course, you come with your knowledge and you know that perhaps you know that some of the decisions taken in the working group are in conflict with what your mirror committee back in your national standards body think is a good solution. But this is a role you have, and this is a way you contribute to the tasks assigned to the VG. The VG, as I said, we have of course the VGs developing new standards, but you also have VGs which are kind of permanent. If, for example, development of terminology or editorial VGs, but in all VGs you don't work on behalf of your national standards body, but you work there because you are good, because you are technically knowledgeable. I don't know if there are any questions now before we go to the next one, which
yes, we have
okay,
like 4 questions.
Yeah, let me hear.
Okay, first one is from the YouTube chat, Ibu Widayati Sutrisno. Does Mr. Carsten have experiences about furniture's export standardization difficulties, especially wooden furniture?
No, but I know something about it. I mean, first of all, okay, my experience is mainly from the European market, but it's also the most strict market you can find in the world, probably. When it comes to furniture, then it's one of these areas which is not really, it's not covered by a specific framework legislation. We have a directive for machines, but we don't have a directive for furniture or similar kind of goods. So therefore, it falls into this basket, which is covered by the General Safety Directive. It means that the product shall simply just live up to some principle. It shall not be dangerous. So this is one part of the legislation. It's not so difficult when it comes to furniture. It's not dangerous. But when it comes to wooden furniture, then it becomes a bit more complicated, because then there are, especially for import from countries like Indonesia, like Malaysia, and so on, the legality of the wood used for the furniture. You have in Indonesia SVLK certification, which is acknowledged as equivalent with FSC in Europe. because you need, for the wood used in the furniture, you need a certificate so that they know, the importers in Europe, that it's cut down this wood legally. I mean, it's not something which people have just run out in the forest and taking it without any approval, and no, I mean, they should plant new trees and so on. So I think the most complicated is actually that you need a certification when it's a wooden furniture, and it is. I met with the business association for furniture. Is it Asmindo? I can't remember now, but I met with one of these, and they gave an example of how hysterical they can be, and it was unfortunately in my country, in Denmark, where they had made some furniture, and there was a small piece of this furniture which was another kind of wood. This wood was imported to Indonesia from Ukraine, I think it was, but there was no certificate for this small part. So it's really important that all the wood used for furniture is covered by the certificate. So yeah. So this is what I know. It's not about, we don't have standards you should live up to, unless it's some furniture which is used for very specific things, like for children or something like that. Then we may have something specific, but in general, no. Yes, and the next question.
Okay, I see that Pak Tungku Hanafia is raising hand. Do you want to ask the question directly, Pak Tungku Hanafia? Silakan, Pak.
Okay, can you hear me? Thank you.
Yes, Pak.
Mr. Kudal. There are 3 additional principles of international standard development by ISO on top of those of WTO, TBT, one of which is due process. I'm not really familiar with this due process. Could you please elaborate a little bit on these issues? Thank you.
This fair and respectful, I think it's written in, yeah. It's, I must say, I have not given it a lot of attention. I haven't been sitting and studied a lot about this. It's about ensuring, my understanding is that it is again with a little standardization. Okay, let me start like this. Standardization was for many years very much dominated by developing countries. United States, Europe, Japan, Australia, perhaps. They are very active here and there. And sometimes standards were developed, and all the other members of ISO were basically sidelined in this process. And I think it's a very general principle. Like, for example, if you want to meet, why do you have to meet in New Zealand? Okay, it is expensive for people from New Zealand to go to Europe, for example, all the time. But you also have to somehow make it realistic for all members of ISO to participate in work. So it's not something you can, which is clearly reflected in the work. It's more the behavior. We had the same problems in Europe, where we have actually 3 regional standardization organizations, Senelec, well-known, you can say they're sisters or brothers to ISO and IC, but we also have ETSI, or we still have ETSI, which is for telecommunication, you can say a bit related to ITU under UN. But ETSI consequently, even though it was very interesting and areas also for the consumers, they consequently had their meetings in areas where it was very difficult to get there, it was very expensive, and so on. This is not a fair way to do. It was simply a way to make obstacles for these critical consumers. So my understanding of the ISO is a bit the same, that you shall somehow organize things so that it is possible also for organizations with less resources to participate in the work. So it's not something, it's again, it's a value or a principle, but it's not something we can say it's here it is. It's behavior of the stronger players in the system. I hope this is my elaboration, and there may be others if you look it up. I will give you a link to Good Standardization Practice,
Okay.
ISO, and then you can read specific. But I think it's this.
Yeah, thank you. For me, attending this kind of Zoom meeting is to refresh and also to update my knowledge. I used to be BSN staff. Thank you.
Okay, nice. Yes, thank you. I'm also a former standardizer, so we are in the same boat. Okay,
but retired.
I'm not retired.
But I'm retired, but not expired.
Exactly, it's a good expression.
Thank you, thank you.
Do we have more?
Thank you, Pak Tungku. We have one from Ibu Jessica Hanafi from Life Cycle Indonesia. And the question is, what is the best practice for the National Mirror Committee involvement in the Technical Committee Working Group? If Ibu Jessica Hanafi is here, you can also describe your question. Thank you.
Yeah, so in the working group, in the technical working group, yeah, usually we need to discuss with National Mirror Committee, right? But what is the actual practice or best practice to do that? Because sometimes it is difficult for us to discuss as well with the Mirror Committee, and also can we discuss as well with the Mirror Committee, because sometimes there are issues in the technical working group as well. We have to discuss nationally, maybe if it's related to trade or something, political or something. Maybe if you can advise based on your experience, what would be the best practice to do it? Thank you.
Thank you. I have to. You are sitting where you are sitting in a national.
I'm sitting in a working group, and also
on the PSN, or you're sitting in a working group in ISO.
In the ISO and also in the PSN.
Okay, good. I mean,
yeah.
It's pretty clear. I think you have also been told when you were nominated for a working group, meaning that you are a one-day trust, is technical, knowledgeable, and so on. Then you work there with your backgrounds. But it doesn't mean that you cannot talk to your mirror committee in Indonesia. Of course you can. As long as you don't bring up political issues, but it's not political. If something, for example, you say trade related, if something presents some kind of obstacles or presents problems to your industry, if you draft it as the others, they present it, then you are welcome to bring it on the table, because it's more that you are not obstructing the work. You are actually bringing in some aspects which may not be pure technical. They are perhaps more trade related, but standards are made for trade. Many of them, at least, are made for ensuring a smooth trade. So this is a part of your package. You can say your package of knowledge is that if we do this, then you create a lot of problems for this kind of countries, also for Indonesia. It's fair. It's not. Okay. It's not a breach. It's another thing if you are instructed. If you are two in, if you're, I guess you're also sitting in the technical committee, aren't you? Only in the. Yep. Yeah. It's clear if you had another colleague from BSN in the committee, and this guy or woman, she instructed you to, to ensure certain things, even though you know better. then
I see.
then it will. But it's a part of your knowledge that you both are technical, I guess. But you also have some trade knowledge and know, and this is okay to bring it in. This is not. I mean, Indonesia is unique, but it's not so unique that the problem may not arise in other countries. And then you will just. This is a way to avoid a lot of critical comments in the public inquiry phase. So I think it's very fair. It's very fair to bring in such things. It's
so in your I understand. So in your experience, that means when it is a technical expertise, then it becomes a package, and not necessarily that we need to consult with the mirror committee, because we discussed once or twice. I asked, okay, and then the answer would be like, oh, that's the capability or the capacity of the technical expertise. So not necessarily you have to discuss with the mirror committee. That is,
you don't have to.
Okay.
You don't have to. No. You don't have to. But if you feel more confident, also want to consolidate or strengthen your arguments in the working group, then I think it's absolutely fair that you discuss this with the mirror committee. But of course, send back to the working group with some kind of closed mandate, then we have a problem. Then you have a problem, because this is the idea. You don't get a mandate from the mirror committee. You work based on your experience and your expertise. But of course, you can help them. Okay.
All right. Thank you. That's very clear. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay. Last one for this session. It's Ibu Nelly Jumalia from Ministry of Manpower. She asks, why doesn't ISO have the authority or jurisdiction to enforce the standard it sets? Thanks a lot. Mungkin Ibu Nelly juga boleh menambahkan jika ada di sini.
Why don't what you said one time? I have to have.
Why doesn't ISO have the authority or jurisdiction to enforce the standards it sets?
Enforcement is a strong word. First of all, ISO is a private organization. It's not a public organization. It doesn't, and in general, you don't find any international organizations, not even UN or WTO, or they don't have any power actually to enforce anything. This is what makes it unique in Europe. We have actually a commission, which of course has a process where they approve things with consultations or involvement of the member states, but they have authority to over the countries. But in UN institutions, and also in ISO, which is not a UN institution, they don't have so. It's a private organization. ISO is not related, has no. They work with governments and so on, but the governments they are just stakeholders like other interested parties. So enforcement it's based on voluntary participation and voluntary outputs, voluntary standards, and then the single members, they can choose what they want to adopt, and even when they adopt it, it's still voluntary. The adoption is basically a way to promote a standard in a specific country, because the national standards body and perhaps the committee responsible for this area think that this is a standard which is really good. We want to promote it by making it a national standard. And at the same time, they withdraw former or old conflicting national standards. So enforcement is more to, this is a policeman. The policeman is the one who enforces, and this will, it cannot be done by a private organization. And you can also, now we are talking about enforcement, then it's hard not to mention making standards mandatory. it is absolutely not recommended by ISO either. Standards are formulated as standards. They are not formulated as legislation. And if you start saying, for example, back to my example with the lift, if you make such a standard mandatory, then first of all, you will never have in Indonesia, for example, a Chinese lift any longer. And it means that lifts will be much more expensive because there are all these requirements where some of them are luxury requirements, others are safety requirements. So standards are made, prepared to be standards and be voluntary. And then I know that in certain circumstances, it's good to make them mandatory. It is typically in construction area where there are a lot of safety issues to take into account, and there's quite often also a building regulation, and they use standards as references because otherwise the building regulation will be so complicated. Then it's better to say, if we shall calculate statics and so on for a building, then it's better to say we shall use this standard, and it should be documented this way as it's written in the standard. So back to the question, ISO is a private organization. They develop voluntary standards, and then the national standards body, they adopt them as voluntary standards. And in specific exceptions, they make them mandatory, but this is not what is recommended. And it's not recommended to use them as a basis for certification either, actually. I hope it was a reply to the question.
I think that's the end of the question for this session. Carsten, okay. You may continue.
Okay, we have another, it's just 25 minutes. And it means that I can just take the next one and then we save the last part for tomorrow. 3 ways of developing standards. There are 3 ways you can develop standards, and I know that one of them is the most common one in Indonesia and in many countries. But the one I will start with is to follow international standardization and adopt the final publications as national standards. This is the one where you say there's a new standard on its way. It's an area which is of huge interest to us. We want to participate in one way or another. There are different levels. And then at the end of the day, when we have developed this standard together with our colleagues in ISO, then we publish it as a national standard. Then you can use the catalog of ISO and IC standards and whatever, ASTM it can also be, standards as a kind of a catalog, and then you pick out standards and say, this standard is now used so much, or it's so needed by our users or stakeholders or industry, typically in our country, that we just pick it out and make it a national standard. There are different ways of doing it. You can take it identical, which is the absolute best way to do it. Remember all the time that standards are voluntary. So, but you can also modify it, which is, I don't think it's so relevant for a country like Indonesia, but it is relevant in more poor countries where you, for example, have test methods which require advanced equipment they do not have in general in the country. Then you have to say that for this test, we use another method than the one required in the standard, simply because otherwise we cannot test. And then you can develop pure national standards, which happens rarely today. It was very common in Europe until the mid-80s. The portfolio of DIN standard, the German standards, was very famous for its quality and its correctness and its coherency, but it was also standards which were descriptive. You have 2 kinds of ways of making standards. They can be descriptive or they can be performance-based. DIN standards were very much descriptive. It means that things should look like this. I mean, you standardized the whole product. So the possibility of making innovative solutions was very difficult with DIN standards. Today, all modern standards in ISO, in European standardization, they are, if possible, made performance-based. There are, of course, things or products where you have to put some, say, it shall be so big. If you have a 30 feet container, then it has to be 30 feet. You can't just say, but this one is 32 feet, or this one is 28 feet. You have to follow. So then it is descriptive, but there may be other elements or requirements to a container, which is not descriptive, but performance-based. Okay, it was a bit around other things, but let's firstly see what happens if you follow international standardization and adopt the final publication as a national standard. Firstly, you shall decide what kind of membership do you want to have of the committee. You can be a participating member or you can be an observing member. And there are some criteria which goes for all countries. Now I have said that it's for Indonesia, but this is in all countries. Are there interested parties in Indonesia? Now, I was very glad to hear that there was a representative in a working group in ISO talking to me. But sometimes, and it requires that you are a participating member. It requires that you go out, participate in TC meetings and in working group meetings. Sometimes if you are nominated for a working group. So interested parties in Indonesia also means that the last one, that there is some financial means available, that BSN in this case, or industry behind interested in this specific standard, that they are willing to finance the costs, because it is costly to travel around and stay at a hotel and so on and so on. It shall be a standard of importance to Indonesia. I don't think that there are any people who just participate because it's fun. It's too expensive to do that. So it shall be of importance to the national interests, and then there shall be human resources or expertise available. Because if you go in, let's say one thing which is very up in, discussed very much for the time being is, for example, digital digital standards used for trade and so on. This is important for many countries, also for Indonesia, but you shall find the right person who wants to participate in this if you want to influence it. Because otherwise, I mean, if you send a poor guy like me, who is a lawyer, I mean, I don't have a chance to understand anything of what they are talking about in such a group. So the human resource, the expertise is very important when you decide what to be in this work. When you decide, say, this is a high priority for Indonesia, and we have the expertise, then it's obvious that and we also have the money, then it's obvious to choose to be a participating member. It means that you are involved from a very early phase when new standardization work is developed, in the approval and the preliminary work on the proposal. This is something you're involved in. You can say no if you think it's a bad idea to develop this standard. Therefore, you're also involved in the approval of the work proposal, and then you can make comments to the CD. This is a committee draft. It means the standard which is discussed in the committee before it's sent out for public inquiry. This possibility is also to give comments on committee draft is also possible for the observing member. Sometimes it can be really difficult. I think it's my experience, what I've heard, to be an observing member, and then you get this committee draft, and then you shall sit there without being involved in the drafting, without being involved, but suddenly you have just this committee draft in front of you, and now you should make comments. It can be a challenge, but you have the access to the document, and you can at least prepare yourself if you disagree, prepare yourself for the public inquiry. The public inquiry is open for everyone. So all 100 and more than 60 something members of ISO, they carry out the public inquiry. They make the document, the standard, the draft standard available to the public, and then they can make comments. P&O members' comments, they are not scrutinized, but they are taken very serious in a committee. Other organizations which have not been active in the work, which has not shown any kind of, I mean, they haven't allocated any resources to develop a standard. If they have comments, there is a big risk when they are sitting in a committee looking at the comments that these comments are not taken into account in the public inquiry. But on the other hand, you don't get many from these organizations. You typically, quite often, if you have some disagreement in the working group and perhaps later on in the technical committee, and after the chairman, he has tried to find some kind of consensus solution, but you are still not pleased, then in the inquiry phase, then suddenly it's exactly the same concerns which are raised by this specific country, which was critical to the solution found or achieved in the standardization work. This is what you see quite often. But so so then you actually sit in the working group, discuss something, you disagree, you are overruled, you bring it up again on the committee, in the committee, they disagree with you, you are overruled, then you send it out in public inquiry. This is your last chance to present it. And then you do it, and then you will probably be ignored again, you can say. So this is how it works. But there are different engagement levels depending on what kind of member you are. Oh, sorry. Adopt international and regional standards as national standards. There are different methods of doing this. The most simple one is the endorsement method. Sometimes I've heard the words or the phrase, this is the rubber stamp method. It was used very much in Europe by the new members of the European Union. Many years ago, we got a number of new members, and I was there to help them preparing for the standardization organizations, and they should adopt 15,000 standards in no time. And you cannot sit and scrutinize and analyze every single document. So you took just, say, now we take all the standards under the machinery directive, and then you just made a list, and then they say now they are available here in our organization, and we publish that now we have adopted them as national standards. This is the most easy way to do it. What they typically do is, when you use the endorsement method, is that you put a front page on it. A front page with your own logo, it means BSN's logo, with probably a translation of the title. And then you adopt it as an official without any translation or anything. And it's, as I said, it's suitable for a large number of standards to be implemented quickly. As I said earlier, the pressure from the government or from one of the ministries in Egypt was they felt that there should be adopted more standards. They used the endorsement method. They just made a long list of standards, randomly picked out from the ISO catalog, and then they just adopted them. But they didn't know what they had adopted in fact. So it's for sure a less user-friendly way to adopt standards. The other one is to adopt international standards is with republication. It requires more resources. There are more information to the user about the standard in the forward and so on. And it may be translated into another language. This is something which shall be considered carefully before you start on that, because when you translate technical texts from English to Bahasa, for example, it may be very difficult to find words, the right words in Bahasa. Also in Danish, it's the same problem we have. So when we do it, also in Denmark, we have quite often a translation where you have the English version on one page and the Danish version on the other page. And then we write in the forward that in case there are some deviations between the English text and the Danish text, it means that it can make kind of confusion, perhaps it's even translated wrongly, then it is the English text which is valid. And the reason why we do that, or write that in the forward, is that in case it's used in a contractual context between two companies, then if one of them reads the English version, could be a company in England, and the other one, the Danish one, reads the Danish version, and then they afterwards disagree on something, what should have been delivered, then it's important to say that for legal reasons, it's the English version which is the right one. This is the one which has been adopted in CEN or CENELEC or in ISO and IC. So we translations is something there should be a lot of quality assurance on the translations and so on before you publish it. And at the same time, I would strongly recommend that you have this little phrase that in case there are deviations, it's the English version which is the right one. It's also possible when you do this kind of implementation to modify the standard. If you modify the standard, then you cannot any longer use the number you have in the ISO. If the ISO standard has number 1, 2, 3, 4, then you typically, if you implement it or adopt it identically, then you have, it will be a BSN ISO 1, 2, 3, 4. But if you modify it, then you have to give it a pure BSN number. You can write in the forward that standard is based on this and this ISO standard 1, 2, 3, 4, but you cannot use just BSN / ISO 1, 2, 3, 4 when it's modified. You lose this right to use the standard number from ISO. And then you can develop pure national standards. This is a right for a national standards body, and there are standards which are only of interest to very few countries. I mentioned halal. It's a bad example because it's actually relevant in many countries. But let's say it's another kind of rules for food or something based on a religion which is only in one country. You only see in one country. Then you may need to develop a standard which is a pure national one. The reason why few countries or national standards bodies are actually developing standards, or pure national standards, is that it is very resource demanding, can be difficult to find enough experts in a country to develop a standard. It's time consuming. And there is also the international aspect that there is a risk of creating technical barriers to trade. If the standard somehow covers areas where you also have international standards, then then you don't make it easier to have trade of products which should comply with the standards, because then you have one set of requirements for international trade of this good, and then you have another set of requirements for this product traded domestically. So it's not something you see quite often. I have been involved in one standard for cleaning services in Denmark, and it was because there was a lot of outsourcing of cleaning services from the public, and then they got a lot of offers from cleaning service companies, but these offers were not comparable. So therefore we tried to develop a standard where we somehow made it measurable how good the cleaning services were. And it's very complicated because you have rooms which are clean on different levels. There's a huge difference between how clean it should be in an office and how clean it should be in a room where they have surgeries at a hospital. It should be totally clinical or sterile. So it was, but it was interesting. But you don't see many of these any longer. And then I think if there are some final questions, then we end now with them. And then we continue tomorrow with this one here, which was actually from the very beginning planned to be tomorrow, but I thought I could do it today, but time has run out. And I think you should be allowed also to go home at 4 o'clock. So if you're not home already. So unless there are some questions, they're at least welcome now. Mita, I can see you.
Okay, thank you, Carsten, for your presentation. I guess there's no more question in this chat room.
Okay.
There's one question from Ibu Nelly.
Udah tadi Ibu Mita
Ya,
tadi.
ya, jadi sudah close, sudah habis ya. Terakhir tadi Bu Nelly ya.
Saya sih udah, Bu.
Ya.
Iya sih.
Okay. Okay, Carsten. So maybe we can start over tomorrow afternoon.
Tomorrow morning at 7 o'clock.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, let's do that. I'm glad we have 2 days so that we can be a bit flexible. I think it's the right time to end now, and tomorrow it will also be on time, I'm sure. So, I'll just say thank you for today. I'm sorry I could not organize workshop where you can discuss a lot internally, but I think we had some good and relevant questions which can put a bit more light on some of these issues we have had on the table. So thank you for today. Hope to see most of you tomorrow. I saw some statistics. We always lose people on the 2nd and the 3rd day. So I don't expect more, but I hope to see most of you at least. So thank you for today, and hope to see you tomorrow again at 1 o'clock Jakarta time.
Thank you, Carsten.
Hey, thank you, Carsten.
Welcome. See you
Terima
tomorrow.
kasih Bapak dan Ibu untuk kehadirannya. Sampai
Terima
bertemu
kasih.
lagi besok siang, baik yang di YouTube maupun di Zoom. Terima kasih. Assalamualaikum.
Saya nggak bisa
Assalamualaikum.
siap, Mbak Mita.
Terima kasih.
Terima kasih Mbak Mita. Terima kasih.
Terima kasih Mbak
Mita.
Mbak Mita, saya nggak bisa siap-siap, tolong ya kalau ada Tom Abel.
Oh ya, siap Pak. Oke.
Izin live ya.
Nggak bisa ngisi apa Mbak Wita, tadi pakai handphone baru balik ke pakai komputer.
Terima kasih Mbak Dita.
Izin live.